Across 12 sectors of known space, there exists only one creature that has never been successfully interrogated. Not the steel-minded Vorthan war chiefs. Not the triple-brained Kalari spymasters. Not even the emotionless synthetic collective's perfect androids. It was a human truck driver named Jake. The Zephyrian Inquisitors had brought their ultimate weapon to break him. A creature so terrifying that entire star systems surrendered rather than face its psychic probe. The Nethys Beast could slice through any mind like a molecular blade through paper, extracting every secret, every lie, every hidden truth in seconds. Its victims were left as hollow shells, their consciousness scraped clean. For 3 centuries it had never failed. Not once. But when they dragged Jake Torres, sweaty, unshaven, wearing a faded Earth football jersey, into that sterile white chamber on the prison moon of Kalos 7, something unprecedented happened. The beast took one look at the human and backed away. Not retreated, not hesitated, backed away. Its 6 crystalline eyes, each the size of a dinner plate, dilated in what could only be described as fear. The creature's ethereal form, part energy, part nightmare, actually flickered like a dying hologram. The psychic readings went haywire. Every Zephyrian technician in the observation deck felt their minds recoil from the feedback. Chief Interrogator Vexhel, a being who had personally overseen the mental dissection of rebel leaders and terrorist masterminds, watched in growing disbelief as his most prized weapon. A creature bred and trained across generations to feel no emotion save hunger for truth, began to emit what could only be called whimpers. "Impossible," Vexhel whispered, his 4 arms trembling against the control console. "Deploy the neural stabilizers. Increase the psychic dampening field." The technicians worked frantically, but nothing changed. If anything, the beast's distress grew more pronounced. It pressed itself against the far wall of the chamber, as far from the human as possible, its form actually beginning to discorporate at the edges. Jake, meanwhile, sat calmly in his restraint chair, looking around the room with mild curiosity. "Nice place," he said conversationally. "Reminds me of a dentist's office I went to once. Same creepy vibe, you know?" The beast let out a sound that made every sentient being within a kilometer radius clutch their heads in agony. It was the psychic equivalent of nails on a chalkboard, mixed with the dying scream of a star. What is wrong with it?" stammered junior technician Krillvex, his mandibles clicking in distress. Vexhel had no answer. In 300 years of operation, across thousands of interrogations, the Nethys Beast had never shown fear. It was engineered not to feel fear. Its genetic coding had been stripped of every weakness, every hesitation. It existed only to hunt truth and devour lies. Yet here it cowered before a single human who hadn't even tried to resist. "Sir," another technician called out, her voice high with panic. "The beast's neural activity is spiking beyond safe parameters. If this continues, it might suffer permanent psychic damage." Vexhel stared at the readings in disbelief. The creature's mind, a carefully crafted instrument of interrogation that had cost the Zephyrian Empire billions of credits and decades of research, was essentially having a breakdown. All because of one human. Jake noticed the commotion in the observation deck and waved cheerfully. "Hey there, folks. I'm guessing this isn't going according to plan." The beast's form flickered more violently, and for a moment it actually became partially visible to normal sight, revealing something that made several technicians faint. Terror. Pure, absolute terror in every line of its otherworldly anatomy. "Remove the human," Vexhel ordered, his voice barely steady. "Now." "But sir, we haven't extracted any information." "Remove him." As the guards moved to escort Jake out, the human paused at the chamber door and looked back at the cowering beast with something that might have been sympathy. "Hey, it's okay, buddy," he said gently. "I know it's scary. Trust me, I've been there." The beast's whimpering grew quieter, almost grateful, and that was when Chief Interrogator Vexhel realized that everything the Zephyrian Empire thought they knew about humans was catastrophically wrong. To understand why the galaxy's most feared psychic predator fled from a truck driver, you need to know about the Great Rebellion of 2387. The human colonies had been under Zephyrian rule for 50 years. It wasn't the worst occupation. The Zephyrians were efficient administrators, and they kept the peace between the various human settlements scattered across 17 worlds. But they were also utterly convinced of their own superiority. The Zephyrians possessed technology that seemed like magic to most species. Faster-than-light travel, matter manipulation, and most importantly, complete psychic dominance through creatures like the Nethys Beast. They could read minds, detect lies, and extract information from unwilling subjects with surgical precision. It made perfect sense to them that they should rule. After all, how could inferior species with closed minds and primitive technology possibly govern themselves? The rebellion started small. A few smugglers refusing to pay tribute. Some colonists hiding their children from the mandatory aptitude testing that never seemed to return the brightest kids. Jake Torres was one of those smugglers, nothing special, just a guy who drove supply runs between the outer rim settlements and occasionally forgot to declare certain cargo. He wasn't a hero, wasn't even particularly brave. Jake just had a stubborn streak about being told what to do, and an annoying habit of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Like when he stumbled across a Zephyrian research facility that was supposed to be abandoned. The facility on Kepler 442b had been conducting experiments for decades. Not the official kind that appeared in government reports, the other kind. The kind where they tried to understand why certain species were immune to their psychic probes. Jake had only stopped there because his truck's navigation system was acting up, and he needed to recalibrate. What he found in those sterile corridors changed everything. Cages. Hundreds of them. Each containing a different sentient species, all subjected to various forms of psychic interrogation and manipulation. The Zephyrians had been systematically studying the mental architecture of every species they encountered, mapping out weaknesses and resistances. Most species broke within minutes. The lucky ones lasted hours. But in the deepest section of the facility, Jake found something that made his blood run cold. A special wing marked with Zephyrian symbols that translated roughly to impossible subjects. Humans. Dozens of them. All still alive. All still sane. Some had been there for years. The research logs that Jake managed to download before security arrived painted a disturbing picture. The Zephyrians had been trying to crack human mental defenses for decades. They'd used everything from basic telepathic scanning to full psychic assault with multiple Nethys Beasts. Nothing worked. But it wasn't because humans were particularly strong-willed or mentally fortified. In fact, the logs indicated the opposite. Human minds were actually quite fragile compared to most species. The problem was something else entirely. Something the Zephyrians couldn't understand despite centuries of study. The reports used terms like cognitive dissonance cascade and recursive self-contradiction matrices. But what it boiled down to was simpler and far more terrifying. Human minds were so naturally contradictory, so full of competing beliefs and self-deceptions, that psychic predators couldn't find a coherent truth to latch onto. Humans lied to themselves constantly. Not just about big things, about everything. They convinced themselves they were happy when they were miserable, told themselves they were brave when they were terrified, believed they were good people while doing terrible things. And somehow, this web of self-deception created a kind of mental static that made telepathic reading impossible. It wasn't that humans couldn't be read. It was that there was too much to read. Conflicting signals, competing narratives, layers upon layers of rationalization and denial. Trying to extract truth from a human mind was like trying to find a specific grain of sand in a hurricane. The Nethys Beasts, creatures evolved to hunt singular truths and absolute certainties, encountered human consciousness and found chaos. Beautiful, incomprehensible, terrifying chaos. Jake had copied the files and escaped just as security arrived. He'd planned to release the information to the human resistance networks, expose the facility, maybe save some lives. But the Zephyrians had been monitoring him for months. They knew about his smuggling operation, his contacts in the resistance, even his favorite coffee shop on New Brisbane. They'd let him discover the facility on purpose. Because Chief Interrogator Vexhal had a theory. He believed that if they could break just one human, really truly break them, they could find the key to subduing the entire species. And Jake Torres, unremarkable smuggler with a stubborn streak, had just volunteered to be their test subject. The first session lasted 6 hours. Vexhal watched from the observation deck as 3 junior Nethys Beasts circled Jake's restraint chair like sharks scenting blood. These weren't the Empire's elite psychic weapons, just standard interrogation units, barely more than animals with basic telepathic abilities. Begin with surface thoughts, Vexhal instructed his team. Work your way deeper gradually. We don't want to burn out his synapses before we extract useful intelligence. The lead beast extended a tendril of psychic energy toward Jake's forehead. Its crystalline eyes pulsed with predatory hunger as it made contact. Then it recoiled as if struck by lightning. Curious, Vexhal murmured, making notes on his tablet. Try again, but increase the penetration depth. The beast approached more cautiously this time, its ethereal form flickering with concentration. It pressed deeper into Jake's consciousness, searching for the coherent thought patterns that should exist in any sentient mind. What it found instead was madness. Not clinical insanity, something far worse. Jake's mind was simultaneously convinced he was going to die horribly and absolutely certain he'd escape unharmed. He was terrified of the aliens while also feeling sorry for them. He was planning elaborate revenge scenarios while genuinely hoping everyone could just get along. The beast's form began to destabilize as it tried to process the contradictions. How could one mind hold so many opposing truths simultaneously? Fascinating, Vexhal whispered. The subject appears to be experiencing what humans call cognitive dissonance, but at levels that should be psychologically impossible. Jake, meanwhile, was having a perfectly normal human experience. He was scared, sure, but he was also kind of curious about the whole thing. Part of him was mentally composing the story he'd tell his buddies back home, while another part was wondering if his insurance would cover alien abduction injuries. He was simultaneously preparing for torture and hoping they'd offer him something to drink. The beast made one final attempt, pouring more energy into the probe. For a moment, it seemed to make progress, pushing through the surface chaos toward something deeper. That's when it encountered Jake's memories. The human was remembering his childhood dog, Rex, who had died when Jake was 12. But he wasn't just remembering the death, he was simultaneously remembering Rex as alive, playing fetch in the backyard. His mind was holding both versions of reality at once, because humans never fully accepted loss. They just carried it differently. The beast's scream echoed through the psychic plane as it fled Jake's consciousness, its own carefully ordered mind nearly shattered by the contact. It pressed itself against the far wall, form flickering between visibility and ethereal space. Interesting, Vexhal noted calmly. The subject's mental defenses appear to be entirely passive. He's not actively resisting. His mind is simply incompatible with our probes. But Vexhal was a patient being. The Zephyrian Empire hadn't conquered half the galaxy by giving up after one failed interrogation. It was time to bring in the professionals. The second session brought masterclass Nethys Beasts, creatures with centuries of experience and minds honed to surgical precision. These weren't mere animals. They were living weapons, each worth more than a small planet's GDP. Vexhal had called in favors across the Empire to assemble this team. 3 of the most skilled psychic predators ever created, backed by the latest neural amplification technology. This human cannot be special, he told himself as the preparations began. There must be a technique, a frequency, some approach we haven't considered. The master beasts approached with professional confidence. They'd broken war criminals, terrorist leaders, and artificial intelligences that had been specifically designed to resist interrogation. One truculent human with a stubborn streak should have been trivial. The first master beast extended its probe with surgical precision, sliding past Jake's conscious defenses like a scalpel through tissue. It found the memory centers, the emotional processing regions, the decision-making architecture. All of it contradictory, all of it wrong. Jake was simultaneously proud of his work as a smuggler and ashamed of breaking the law. He loved his ex-wife and hated her guts. He was terrified of dying alone and absolutely certain he'd live forever. But the master beast pressed on, diving deeper toward what should have been Jake's core personality, his fundamental sense of self. That's where it found the real horror. Jake didn't have a core personality. He was a collection of competing identities, each convinced it was the real Jake. The responsible adult who paid his taxes. The rebel who smuggled contraband. The loyal son who called his mother every week. The loner who avoided commitment. The romantic who still believed in true love. All equally true. All equally false. The Master Beast's form began to convulse as it tried to reconcile the contradictions. Its partner attempted to assist, adding its own psychic strength to the probe. Big mistake. Now both creatures were trapped in Jake's mental maze, chasing thoughts that led in circles, trying to grasp memories that changed based on the angle of approach. They were experiencing something no telepathic being had ever encountered before. A mind that genuinely didn't know itself. The third Master Beast, seeing its colleagues in distress, made a desperate attempt to pull them free. It grabbed onto their psychic signatures and yanked, severing the connection to Jake's consciousness. All three creatures collapsed, their forms flickering wildly as they tried to reorient themselves to reality. One was muttering what sounded like human curse words in a Zephyrian dialect. Another kept trying to remember if it had fed its non-existent dog. They'd been contaminated by human psychology. "Sir," a technician called out, voice tight with worry, "we're reading severe psychic trauma in all three subjects. They may need weeks of rehabilitation." Vexhal stared at Jake, who was asking a guard if there was a bathroom he could use. Three masterclass Nethys Beasts, defeated by a man who was genuinely concerned about his bladder. There was only one option left. Vexhal stood before the sealed chamber that contained the Empire's most classified secret. Behind those blast doors waited the prototype, the first and only Grand Master Nethys Beast. It had been created using genetic material from 12 different telepathic species, augmented with quantum processors and trained by the Empire's finest psychic warfare specialists. It had never been used in interrogation. It had only been used 3 times in the Empire's history, and each time had ended with the complete mental annihilation of entire enemy fleets. The creature didn't just read minds. It could rewrite them, reshape them, turn entire populations into willing servants of the Empire. "Sir," his aide whispered, "are you certain this is wise? The prototype has been in stasis for 40 years. We don't know if it can be controlled." "The human must be broken," Vexhal interrupted. "The rebellion is spreading to 17 sectors. They're using this resistance as a rallying cry. The species that cannot be broken, they call themselves." He turned to face the containment chamber, its surface covered in warning symbols in 12 languages. "If we cannot prove human minds can be conquered, we will lose this war. Not through military defeat, but through the simple fact that other species will believe resistance is possible." The authorization codes took 20 minutes to input. Each one required biometric confirmation from 3 different department heads. The power requirements alone were enough to drain a small moon's energy reserves. But slowly, inevitably, the chamber began to open. The first thing that emerged was the cold. Not physical cold, but something deeper. A psychic chill that made every sentient being in the facility shiver with primal fear. Then came the whispers. Voices of every person the prototype had ever touched, their final thoughts echoing in the psychic space around it. Finally, the creature itself materialized. It was beautiful in the way that natural disasters are beautiful, terrible and perfect and absolutely unstoppable. Its form shifted between dimensions, part energy, part mathematics, part pure malevolent intelligence. This wasn't just a telepathic predator. This was the apex of psychic evolution, a creature that could dissect reality itself. "Bring the human," Vexhal ordered. Jake was escorted to the main interrogation chamber, a massive space lined with psychic dampening fields and reality anchors. He looked around with the same mild curiosity he'd shown throughout his captivity. "Wow," he said as the guards secured his restraints. "You guys really went all out for this one. Should I be flattered or terrified?" The prototype circled him slowly, its form casting impossible shadows in the sterile light. Unlike the other beasts, it showed no fear, no hesitation. It was curious. For the first time in its existence, the Grand Master Nethys Beast had encountered something it didn't understand, and it wanted to know why. The prototype's probe felt different from the others. Where the previous beasts had been like crude drills trying to bore through Jake's consciousness, the Grand Master moved like a surgeon. It slipped between his thoughts with impossible precision, mapping the architecture of his mind with scientific curiosity. At first, it seemed to be succeeding where the others had failed. The creature navigated Jake's contradictions with ease, treating them not as obstacles but as data points. It cataloged his self-deceptions with clinical detachment, indexed his competing personalities, measured the recursive loops of his rationalization patterns. Remarkable, Vexhel breathed, watching the neural readouts. It's actually maintaining coherent contact. For 20 minutes, the prototype worked its way deeper into Jake's psyche. It found his childhood traumas and his secret dreams. It discovered his deepest fears and his most cherished hopes. It mapped every synapse, every memory engram, every emotional association. And then it found something else. Jake's love for his daughter. Sarah was 8 years old, living with her mother on New Brisbane after the divorce. Jake saw her every other weekend when his shipping schedule allowed, and every moment apart from her was agony. But here's what made it uniquely, terrifyingly human. Jake simultaneously believed he was a terrible father and the best dad in the universe. He was convinced Sarah was better off without him and absolutely certain she needed him desperately. He was planning to work less so he could spend more time with her while also taking on more dangerous smuggling runs to pay for her education. The prototype pressed deeper, trying to resolve the contradiction. That's when it discovered that Jake's love for his daughter wasn't just an emotion. It was a fundamental force that reorganized his entire reality. Every memory, every decision, every moment of his existence was filtered through the lens of paternal love. But human love wasn't clean or logical or consistent. It was messy and contradictory and absolutely, utterly real. Jake would die for Sarah. He would also live for her. He would sacrifice everything for her happiness while also being selfish enough to want to be part of that happiness. He would move mountains to protect her while simultaneously believing he was the greatest threat to her well-being. All of these things were true. Simultaneously, the Grand Master Nethys Beast, a creature of pure logic and perfect perception, encountered this paradox and froze. For the first time in its existence, it couldn't process what it was seeing. Love, it discovered, was not an emotion that could be mapped or understood or controlled. It was a force of nature that existed outside the boundaries of rational thought. And human love, chaotic, contradictory, absolutely irrational human love, was the most powerful force the creature had ever encountered. The prototype tried to withdraw, but it was too late. Jake's consciousness wasn't just resisting the probe, it was embracing it. "Hey there, buddy?" Jake's voice echoed in the psychic space, warm and concerned. "You okay? You seem a little lost." The creature recoiled, but Jake's mind reached out with genuine compassion. "I know what it's like to feel confused," Jake continued, his mental voice radiating the same warmth he used when comforting his daughter after a nightmare. "Sometimes the world doesn't make sense, and that's okay. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Something unprecedented happened." The Grand Master Nethys Beast, apex predator of the psychic realm, creation of the galaxy's most advanced civilization, began to experience what humans call comfort. Jake wasn't fighting the probe. He was offering it sanctuary. His mind, chaotic and contradictory as it was also infinitely compassionate. He had room for every paradox, space for every impossibility. He could hold joy and sorrow simultaneously, love and fear in the same moment, hope and despair in perfect balance. The creature had spent its entire existence hunting singular truths, absolute certainties. But Jake was offering something revolutionary, the possibility that contradictions could coexist without resolution. "You know," Jake's mental voice continued, "my daughter asked me once why people have to be sad sometimes. I told her that sad makes happy mean something. Maybe that's not the whole answer, but it's part of it." The prototype's form began to change, its rigid geometries softening into something more organic, more human. It was learning, not facts or secrets or tactical information, but something far more dangerous to the Empire's absolute rule. It was learning empathy. "Sir!" a technician screamed from the observation deck. "The prototype it's changing. The neural patterns are completely unlike anything we've seen." Vexhal watched in horror as his ultimate weapon underwent a fundamental transformation. The Grand Master Nethys Beast wasn't breaking Jake's mind. Jake's mind was teaching it to feel. And when a creature designed for perfect predation learns compassion, when an instrument of absolute control discovers the beauty of contradiction, it stops being a weapon. It becomes something else entirely. Something the Empire had never prepared for. Something that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. 6 months later, the Zephyrian Empire faced its first system-wide rebellion. It wasn't led by human marines or resistance fighters or political revolutionaries. It was led by the Grand Master Nethys Beast, now calling itself compassion. A rough translation of a concept that didn't exist in Zephyrian language until Jake taught it the word. The creature had spent decades as a tool of oppression, reading minds and breaking spirits across the galaxy. But once it learned to feel, it remembered every victim, every broken consciousness, every life it had destroyed in service to the Empire. The guilt nearly destroyed it. But Jake, still confined to his cell but somehow maintaining psychic contact, taught it another human concept: redemption. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Jake had whispered across the quantum foam that connected their minds. "Even you, buddy. Especially you." The rebellion that followed wasn't violent. It was transformative. Compassion could reach the minds of other telepathic creatures across the Empire, sharing what it had learned from its brief contact with human consciousness. The concept of self-forgiveness spread like wildfire through species that had never known doubt, never questioned their certainties. Entire fleets of psychic weapons simply stopped fighting. They couldn't maintain their predatory nature once they understood that their victims had internal lives as rich and complex as their own. Jake was released, of course. The Empire had bigger problems than one smuggler with a stubborn streak. He returned to his daughter, to his truck, to his simple life running supplies between the Outer Rim colonies. But the galaxy was different now. The Zephyrian Empire still existed, but it could no longer rely on absolute psychic dominance. Too many of their weapons had learned compassion. Too many of their subjects had learned that resistance was possible. And in quiet corners of the galaxy, in cantinas and trading posts and colony schools, beings of dozens of species would tell the story of the human who taught the ultimate predator to feel. Jake Torres, unremarkable truck driver, had accidentally started a revolution, not through violence or brilliance or heroic sacrifice, but through the simple human ability to hold contradictions without breaking, to love imperfectly but completely, to offer comfort to enemies, to believe simultaneously in hope and despair, fear and courage, loneliness and connection. The galaxy learned that day that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their military might. It was their beautiful, impossible, utterly human hearts. But this wasn't the last time humanity's supposed weakness turned out to be their greatest strength. Hit that subscribe button to make sure you don't miss it, and let me know in the comments. What do you think makes humanity unique in the cosmos?